Welcome everybody to another live stream repair. Today's going to be a pretty quick and easy one. Fingers crossed. We've just got our one HomePod mailed in to us today for repair for no power. So let's get this box opened up and we'll take a look. Alright, we've got our pod here. Oh, you know what? Let me pop up our repair status here. This one was from Jamie, so we'll put that down. And let's plug this in really quick to our watt meter, just to check that it indeed does not power on, so that we know we've got something that we can fix up, and just so we know how much power it's actually trying to draw. Alright, cool. So no signs of life here. That's probably something we can fix. And we're pulling about 4 watts from the wall. So I'm gonna guess a shorted Schottky barrier diode, like usual. But let's tear this one open and see if we were right. So let's just start by taking this top cover off. Alright, got that off without a problem. Let's get this display out. Take out these 4 T6 screws. Alright, we got those 4 screws out. Now we can get our pry tool underneath that display, and then we'll grab a plastic pry tool, wedge that underneath, pull our metal tool out, and then go around and lift that display up with our plastic tool. This way we can avoid banging and scratching up that plastic frame and the display PCB as much as possible. And once we've carefully lifted that display up, being mindful of the length that we've got from this cable here, we can unlock that and disconnect our display. And then while we're staring it in the face, we may as well get this adhesive put back in place. At least best as you can. It doesn't need to be perfect, just get it on there enough for a reasonable amount of coverage for when we come back here to put the display back on later. And again, it doesn't need to be perfect. just needs to be some on there. There we go. Let's get these screws for the frame out then. There's the 4 holding the plastic frame. And then there's 2 holding the drawstrings for the mesh tight. All right. So we've got those screws out. We can untangle this drawstring for the mesh. Kind of wiggle the mesh around so we can pull this frame out. And then, with that out of the way, we can get our logic board out. Set that to the side. And then we want to get something for our HomePod to sit on, so that way we can pull this mesh down a little bit. There we go. And the reason why you want to put the HomePod on top of something instead of just putting the HomePod raw onto your table and pulling the mesh down is so you can see the mesh here isn't going to be pushing down on the table that it's sitting on. It's actually, we've got a roll of tape here that the base of the HomePod can sit on that extends past the length of the mesh that we need to pull down, so that we can set this on a table nice and solid and not worry about pushing down on things and what's it called? Leaving a whole bunch of marks and indentations and such in the mesh, basically deforming it. So that's my little pro tip for that. We'll get these screws for this top basket taken out. Those are 9 T6 screws. And if you haven't caught on by now, you can basically take apart the whole HomePod with just a T6 screwdriver. Save for the 3 screws underneath the rubber foot on the bottom for the mesh, but for the majority of repairs, if you're not replacing the mesh, you don't need to take it off, so you just need a T6. Kinda nice. Okay, we've got those 9 screws for the top basket out. Before we go and start prying that up, we need to detach this logic cable here from that basket. We're just going to grab with one fingers from one hand, and we're going to take our other hand here and just sort of pull and wedge that away from the basket to get that adhesive removed. Just like that. And now that that's free, double check that we got all those screws taken out of the top, and we can start prying it up. There's 2 different ways you can go about prying this up. You can wedge your screwdriver in between each of the screws for the subwoofer and twist it. There's a couple around the perimeter, and that way you won't scratch up your subwoofer basket. Not that it really matters, but that's one way to do it. And then the other way to do it is, of course, just go around the whole thing and pry it up. And if you go to pry up against the subwoofer screws, you might end up bending them a little bit out of place. So, to each their own method. It's not a big deal. If you bend the subwoofer screws, you can always just bend them back pretty easily too. I think that's loose enough now for us to just pry the rest of this off by hand. Let's give that a shot. We got it. Ooh. Not always easy, but doable. All right, we shall proceed. Before I take these screws out for the subwoofer, I just want to get my vice grips here and just bend them back into straightness. Any of the ones that I may have bent. I can tell the ones that I did bend because they're not centered on those grommets anymore. But the rest of them look good. So we should be able to take these out with relative ease. Okay, got those out. Now we can carefully lift our woofer out of here. Just gonna make sure we get that logic cable out before we start yanking. And we're also going to unplug that woofer. And there we have our woofer. We're just going to peek that coil. Looks good, smells good, feels good. No funny sounds when I wiggle it around. So, good subwoofer speaker. Let's go ahead and get these plastic rings out of the way. And we're just gonna push that grommet and logic cable through, and then take these T6 screws out. And for these ones I am usually lazy. I'll leave these screws, I'll loosen them all the way, but I'll just leave them in there because they have these little rubber gaskets on them. Not sure how well that'll show up for you, but if you can see that, you can easily lose these little grommets here for these screws, these little gaskets. So I like to loosen the screws for this ring, but just leave them in so that I can avoid losing that seal on any of these screws. So we got all those loose. We can just lift this up, keep all those screws in there, and set that to the side. Spin this up and out of the way. And now we have access to our power supply. So we'll unplug that. And then we'll take the screws for the power supply out so we can get it out of the way. Those are just the 4 T6 holding it down, and a bonus connector under the power supply that requires you to pull the power supply straight up to disconnect it safely. So what I like to do for that is, once I've got all 4 screws for my power supply out, I like to grab my plastic hooker. I like to take the hook end and stick that on the side where the AC plug is, and use that to lift this end up. And once we've got that loose, we can just pull this out, and you can see what I'm talking about with this connector on the bottom. That goes into the amp board right here, underneath. So we'll set our power supply to the side, and we will get our logic cable detached from the amp board too. So we'll just unlock that and get it removed. And then we'll take out the 14 T6 screws holding this amp in. Last screw for the amp, and we can finally pull this up and out. We'll set their HomePod shell to the side, and we can move our focus to just the amp board here. Whee! And we are going to jump right in and just, let's see here. Let's grab a multimeter and just check to make sure that our diode here is indeed the culprit. It's got 1748K on it for the date code, so almost definitely. Yep, it's shorted. So let's get our hot air, crank that up. And let's go right to town. just heating up the other side of the board a little bit. Not actually sure how much this helps. We'll go at it from the front now. And I'm just going to keep poking it until it lets me push it right off the board. Just like that. So now that we've got the old diode off, let's put that in the graveyard before we mix it up with the others. And let's grab a fresh one. And let's grab our soldering iron and get all this stuff prepped up. I'm going to put some flux on our board. Some flux on our diode, our new diode. And then we will grab our iron. We are going to clean our iron tip and then put some fresh solder on that. Quite a bit on that big pad on the board, so I'm just going to soak a little bit of that up. Very good. Got the diode and the board tinned up with some fresh solder. So let's place a little more flux on there. We'll line up our diode. Very nice. Let's get that soldered into place with our heat gun. Gorgeous. Wonderful. Let's get that cleaned up really quick. I'm just going to take some isopropyl alcohol and Q-tips here. Okay. Let's bring our test components in, and what we want to do now is just make sure now that, well, first of all, that this powers on, so that's primarily what it came in for, but now that it powers on, we need to check and see if it's also got the dreaded DC offset issue, which is that popping and death farts and such, other base issues. So the DC offset popping and the no power issues are mutually exclusive. Like they don't cause one another or interfere with one another's symptoms, but they can both happen to your pod. So if we get no power fixed, it's always good to check for DC offset once you've got it, since you've got it apart. And to do that, we are just going to throw a power supply on here onto their amp board, and we're going to grab a logic board that we've already pre-configured, connect that up, and we're also going to plug a subwoofer into their amp. And we're also going to grab our multimeter, stick that into DC voltage mode. We're interested in how many millivolts the subwoofer is seeing once the amp turns on. Anything more than 50 millivolts or any noticeable gradual increase in any amount over a short period of time will warrant replacing the filtering capacitors on the back of the amp. So let's find out. Let's grab our power supply here and feed some power, and we'll see. So good sign, our no power repair worked. It's now powering on. So we'll wait for that to boot up, and once it finishes booting, we will wake it up, which will turn the amp on, and we can check how much DC, if any offset, how much DC offset's on here. So it's finished booting. We're just gonna tap and hold the top really quick, and it is above the 200 millivolt scale, so we're going to jump up to the 2 volt scale, and we've got 370 millivolts of DC offset and already at 400. So this is a pretty bad result. Like I said before, you don't want to see this any higher than like 50 millivolts. But you also don't want to see it gradually increasing either. So the fact that this is already at 500 millivolts, which is 10 times that acceptable amount, and the fact that it started at 370 millivolts just 30 seconds to a minute ago, we're already at 520. That's a pretty bad sign. So if we listen carefully while I unplug the power from it, we've got a rather healthy pop from that subwoofer. So all these are signs that, sure, we got the no power issue fixed, but they've still got some DC offset issues. Two completely unrelated issues. Usually the popping you can live with until it gets so bad that it starts frying other components. The no power issue, obviously, you can't really work around that or ignore it. If it's not powering on, you can't use the thing at all. So no power usually tends to be the point where people send them in for repair. People usually ignore the popping because it's hard to tell whether the popping is actually at the point where it needs repair or not. At this point, I'm really just rambling. Let's flip their amp around, and we will need to replace these 4 capacitors. These 4 big size 1206 caps. Are they size 1206? Yeah. These are size 1206, 10 microfarad, probably 16 volt, 10% rated filtering capacitors. And you've got your DAC right here, and you've got your amplifier here. Now, each tweeter has its own amp, and the subwoofer has its own amp. So the reason why we only hear the popping coming from the subwoofer and not any of the tweeters is because the DC offset is coming from these 4 capacitors. And this DAC here feeds the audio, the digital audio. It takes the audio signal from the logic board. Excuse me. Excuse me. Excuse me. The DAC takes the digital audio from the logic board, converts that obviously to an analog audio signal for the subwoofer, and that signal gets passed through, all this crap. On its way, it goes through these filtering capacitors that are supposed to remove any DC. And then it gets to your amplifier for the subwoofer. And that's where anything, a couple of millivolts of DC here could equal a dozen or a couple hundred millivolts once it actually gets amplified. And then that gets sent to the subwoofer. So what usually happens is these caps start to lose their effectiveness at removing that inherent DC in the amplification circuit for the subwoofer. And as a result, that DC continues to get amplified from the subwoofer's amp, which can put more of a load on the subwoofer amp. It can damage your subwoofer speaker voice coil because the subwoofer speaker, as a result of getting DC pumped into it, it's now defaulting in a certain different position than its neutral magnetic field. And the amp has to work to hold that subwoofer there. And it's pumping that energy through your voice coil. And the way that your speaker keeps itself cool is by moving. So if it's getting a constant DC signal telling it to hold the subwoofer one way or the other, it doesn't have a chance to cool that down. So that's usually how your subwoofers will die as a result of out of control DC offset. And then the farting will happen if the DC measured reaches a couple of volts. Heat will make this worse. So the hotter it gets during operation, the larger the DC will grow until it reaches that 2, 3-ish, maybe a little more volts threshold. That causes the DAC and the amp to force restart, and that's the death part that you hear. That bass drop sound is actually, I believe, programmed into the DAC or the amp as part of its hard reset behavior. It's actually telling you that it's hard reset, so it's actually pretty interesting. Enough rambling. Let's get these 4 filtering capacitors right here replaced, and we should see our DC go from a previous result of around 500 millivolts on a cold boot to ideally no more than 50. So let's get some flux on here just to make it a little easier. If you're doing this yourself, I would recommend taking the power supply out before you do this, because you're going to be using a lot of heat to get these caps off. If you use a heat gun, Excuse me. I've got my special test power supply in here that's got the plastic already cut out. That gives me a little room to be lazy. I don't have to keep taking the power supply out and putting it back in when I'm replacing these capacitors and retesting over and over. So, let's just get right into it. Alright, we got those 4 caps off. I know the camera quality is less than ideal. I apologize. I'm working with what I've got here. But we've got those 4 caps taken out. So next, we're going to grab our iron and just clean up these pads and prep them for a set of new capacitors. Okay, we got those pads tinned up. Let's grab our new replacement capacitors here. And let's pop these new caps on. So of course we want to put some fresh flux on there. And grab our new caps. Almost had a major disaster there. That one wanted to take off on us. But all is well. Let's flux up the pads for the second cap. Good, let's flux up for the third. And the fourth and final cap. how does that look? Awesome. Let's let this cool down for just a minute, and we will retest our DC offset measurement here and see if we're ready for reassembly. Went ahead and cleaned up the board already. Let's get our test set back up here. We're going to get a logic cable. And our logic board. Plug our subwoofer in. Connect our multimeter to that. We're going to bump that back down to the millivolt DC scale because I have a good feeling we won't see very much DC offset after that repair. Let's get our power. Here we go. And finally, let's connect this all into the wall. All right, we didn't fuck anything up. It still powers on. Excuse my language. Gotta get used to that. Not cursing. Unless it doesn't matter. I don't know if it matters or not. Okay, it's booted up. Let's test. And we've got a beautiful result of zero, basically. We've got basically zero DC offset, and we're on the millivolt scale now. So that would be about 0.1 millivolts, 0 millivolts. Absolutely beautiful result. And when we unplug that, you barely heard any popping. It's okay if it pops a teeny tiny little bit. But when you see the woofer move and you can really hear it, that's unhealthy. But we've got a great result after that repair for the DC offset and the no power on here. So let's get this torn back down really quick so we can put their parts back together inside the pod. And we should be done. Okay, let's get their shell back in here. Shallow. zoom down in on that. Get a good look at that. And we will start by dropping their amp back in to the shell. And screwing that into place with all 14 of its screws. You get in there. You get in there. All right. You're playing games, and I don't want to play any games. It's one screw. How difficult can it be? Yeah. And you got to do this 14 times. Alright, we got the amp screwed in. Let's reconnect this logic cable. Very nice. And we can set that power supply in. Push that straight in. Line it up with the screw holes, and then you can push it down to connect that bottom connector, and then we can connect this AC plug on its side and screw that down. Power supply's in. We can start putting our rings in place. Good, we can screw this one down. Very good. We can grab our subwoofer now, get our gasket, and plug this back in. Very good. Get our subwoofer screws and screw this subwoofer in. If it wants to cooperate. There we go. Alright, let's put those in all the way. Last screw for the subwoofer. Alright. And if you want to be fancy and you've scratched up your subwoofer screws, you can just come in here with a Sharpie and just Sharpie those in. Not that anybody would ever see these, but if you really, really care and you've scratched up your screws for the subwoofer, you can always just Sharpie them back in. I also do this to some of my own, just out of OCD. I like making them look nice and pristine if I can. Okay. We can finally grab our basket here and find where that logic cable meets up with it and just set that straight down. Oh, I got some resistance here. All right. And ideally, when you're putting this basket back on, you don't want to have any of that old adhesive interfering with it sitting flush. If you do, you can go ahead and just pick out, scrape off any of that adhesive that is interfering with it sitting flush all along the edge here. You kind of want to aim for it being flush before you screw it in instead of relying on the screws to make it all sit even and flush. But worst case, you can just go and scrape out any of that old adhesive sealant that's holding the basket down that's interfering with that. You can just scrape that away. Get yourself a good fit. And for these screws for the basket here, specifically, you do not want to over tighten these. You just want them tight enough to hold the basket snug and flush with the rest of the shell. If you over tighten these screws, it will cause problems with the gaskets underneath, and it will leak sound. It'll sound like it's rattling. But really air is passing through the gaskets because you've tightened the screws so much that it starts to warp the frames and the rings that actually have gaskets. If you want to get real with it, you could totally just use some adhesive too when you go put this top basket back on, but it's pretty unnecessary. More redundant than necessary. Alright, let's just get that logic cable stuck back to the underside of this basket here, because we don't want that rattling as the woofer's working. And we can pull our pull our mesh up till it just starts to cover these screws here. And then we can grab our rubber bits here, covering each of these screws. Put all of those in place. Oh no. Cool. We got all those screw covers on, so we can start pulling this mesh tight. Not all the way yet, because first we need to put our logic board back in. And once we get that in and nice and squared, we can grab our frame, set that on top, and get our drawstrings going opposite ways around the lip of that frame. and at least fed into this section here. So just get the drawstrings wrapped around and put into the frame loosely. And once we got those in loosely, we can start tightening it all down. This is one of the more frustrating parts sometimes, because these drawstrings don't always want to cooperate. Or as soon as you get it, you accidentally undo it. I found it's easiest if you've got a set of tweezers on the side to grab the drawstring from any tight spots if you need to. But there we go. Almost. Okay. So now that we've got the drawstrings going around the side of the frame and then into the hole at the top here, we can loosely put in the first 4 screws for this frame. Just 1 or 2 threads in. And what that will allow us to do is keep the frame in place while still allowing it to lift up just enough to get the mesh fed into the side of the frame all the way around. So we got those 4 screws put in very loose. Let's grab our drawstrings, and we're going to pull the drawstrings up with one hand, straight up, both of them, while we take our other hand and just palm the top of this and start squeezing and pulling this mesh up. And you can keep pulling on the drawstrings to tighten it. And it'll basically just feed itself into this. You might need to assist it here and there. So start pulling up on the drawstrings. That should pull this frame up and give you enough of a gap around to start doing this. And then we can start pulling the mesh in. And that's the magic. That's the magic trick right there. Once you got that pulled up, we can get rid of our base so we can get more of a firm grasp on this. Make sure we've got that nice and tight and fed in there. And then while we're still holding the drawstrings tight to keep the tension, let's go ahead and take our other hand and push this frame down and hold it down while we tighten these screws up. Alright. And then once you've got that, you can let go of your drawstrings and you can go around and just sort of pull the mesh up just a little more. Just try to get it as even and uniform as you want. And we can screw these drawstrings back in. We'll just loop those around a few times. Okay. We've got both of those drawstrings wrapped around their posts and secured. Let's grab our display, plug that back in. And we'll set that down easy peasy. And we'll screw this display into place. Last 4 screws. And then we'll glue this top surface back down and be done for the day. Cool. All right, let's turn our heat down to 330 Celsius. And we're gonna heat up the top a little bit before we place these parts back on together. The heat helps make the adhesive soften up a little bit and get a nice and sticky again. Just be careful with the heat if you do this, because you can very easily damage your parts. Going to set the lip of this into this right here. Line up our plus and minus buttons by eye. And then before we fully commit to that, we're going to stand up and look at it from the top down. And just try to get that as centered as possible. Again, just purely by eye. And once we've got that where we feel happy, we can commit and just push that down. Don't push too hard down on it. You don't want to break your logic board frame or basket here. Crack your top surface. Give yourself more work. All right. Now that we've got that sufficiently greasy, let's get a microfiber cloth and some rubbing alcohol and just wipe that off really quick. Looking good. Last but not least, let's plug this into power. Make sure that, of course, it turns on and that our volume buttons are lined up correctly and that they light up nice and evenly. All right, it's powering on. And
I'm having trouble connecting to the internet.
very good. Our volume buttons are
I'm having trouble.
evenly illuminated and they look great. So we've got ourselves another HomePod fixed for no power and DC offset.
I'm having trouble connecting.
Yeah, I'm sure you are. We will do a thorough sound test off stream. My wife is sleeping right now, so don't want to wake her up. But I'll call this one fixed for the stream. I hope you guys enjoyed watching. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Shoot me an email, whatever works for you. And I'll catch you guys in the next one. Goodbye. Clickety, clickety, click.